Before money was a coin, it was a memory. Someone helped you repair a roof. Someone shared grain after a bad harvest. Someone lent a tool. Someone gave food to a neighbor, knowing that one day the favor might return. This is where the story of debt begins. Not in a bank, not in a market, not with a pile of gold, but in human relationships. The familiar story says money was invented because barter was too difficult. A butcher had meat, a baker had bread. One wanted what the other had. But what if their wants did not match? Economists call this the problem of the double coincidence of wants. It is easy to understand. If I have fish and you have shoes, but you do not want fish, we cannot trade. So the textbook story says people invented money to solve this problem. That story is simple. But many anthropologists argue it is not how most everyday economies began. Barter existed, especially between strangers, enemies, or distant groups. But inside small communities, people often did something more ordinary. They remembered, they trusted, they owed. Imagine a village before coins. A family has extra grain, another family has none. The first family shares, not because they are running a shop, not because they expect exact payment tomorrow, but because life is uncertain. Next season, the situation may reverse. Today I help you, tomorrow you may help me. That is not barter. It is obligation, a soft kind of debt. The first currency was not necessarily metal. It may have been the sentence, "I owe you." An "I owe you" is simple. It says, I received something today, and I will return something later. At first, this can live in memory. Everyone knows who helped whom. Everyone knows who has been generous. Everyone knows who never gives back. This kind of economy is human before it is commercial. People are not only buyers and sellers, they are neighbors, relatives, guests, allies, debtors, creditors. But not yet in the harsh, modern sense. Debt begins as a relationship. Only later does it become a number. Everyday sharing is easy to miss because it looks too ordinary. Someone lends a bowl. Someone watches a child. Someone helps in the field. Someone brings food during sickness. No one writes an invoice, but the relationship changes. A small obligation is created. This is why debt is so powerful. It begins inside trust. Then institutions learn to count it. A favor becomes a mark becomes a record becomes proof. Once a debt is written down, it no longer depends only on memory. It can be stored, copied, transferred, collected. A clay tablet can remember more coldly than a person. It does not care if the harvest failed. It does not care if a child is sick. It does not forget because you are a neighbor. The ledger changes the relationship. Before the ledger, the question is human. What do we owe each other? After the ledger, the question becomes mathematical. How much is owed? When is it due? And who has the power to enforce it? When power enters debt, a promise becomes something else. It becomes a system. In ancient Mesopotamia, temples and palaces managed large stores of grain, silver, animals, land, and labor. They needed records. A temple could not run only on memory. It had fields to manage, workers to feed, goods to distribute, caravans to finance. So scribes pressed marks into clay tablets. Those tablets were not just early writing. They were early accounting. They recorded deliveries, loans, rations, payments, obligations. Picture a Sumerian scribe sitting near jars of barley. A farmer brings grain. A merchant takes supplies for a journey. A worker receives rations. The scribe records it all. This is one of the great turning points in human history. Debt becomes durable. A promise can now survive distance and survive time. It can survive the death of the person who first remembered it. The clay tablet makes obligation harder, more precise, and more powerful. Long-distance trade needs trust. A caravan leaves the city. It carries textiles, metal, grain, or tools. It may return months later, or it may not return at all. The people who finance that journey need a way to measure risk and time. This is where interest appears. Interest is the price of waiting. If I lend you grain today, you return more later. If I finance a caravan, I expect a gain when it comes back. In ancient Sumer, research suggests that interest rates were often fixed administratively. One famous rate was 1/60th per month, comes to about 20% per year. This number was not just a natural market price. It fit the Sumerian sexagesimal system, a counting system based on 60. That matters, because it means interest was not always born from the invisible hand of supply and demand. It could also come from bureaucracy, from scribes, from fractions, from the need to make obligations fit inside an accounting system. Debt was becoming mathematical, and mathematics does not get tired. Ancient debt often lived between two worlds, barley and silver. Barley was food. It came from fields, it was grown by farmers. It could feed workers. Silver was different. It was more abstract. It could measure value. It could move through long-distance trade. A temple or palace could use both. Barley for daily life, silver for accounting and exchange. But here is the problem. Crops grow slowly. Debt can grow on schedule. A field depends on rain, soil, labor, animals, and luck. A debt tablet depends on a calculation. One bad harvest can make repayment hard. Two bad harvests can make it impossible. The ledger does not shrink because the sky was dry. Interest makes time dangerous at first. Debt looks like help. A loan of grain, a tool, a little silver. But as interest accumulates, the debt can become larger than the household's ability to pay. The curve rises. The harvest does not. That gap is where power appears. Debt becomes more dangerous when it moves from public administration into private power. A temple loan is one thing. A powerful local creditor is another. The creditor can hold the tablet. The creditor can claim the field. The creditor can demand repayment. Now imagine a bad harvest. Farmer does not borrow to get rich. He borrows to survive. He needs seed. He needs food. He needs to keep the household alive until the next season. This is very different from a modern investment loan. It is not about expanding a business. It is about eating. But the tablet does not care why the debt was taken. Survival debt can still carry interest, and if the next harvest also fails, the farmer must pledge more. First a sheep, then a tool, then part of the land, then a family member's labor. Eventually, the debt can reach the body. Debt begins as food. It ends as control. Collateral is the thing you give up if you cannot repay. At first, collateral may be small, a goat, a tool, a measure of grain. But when poverty deepens, the chain moves downward. The field becomes security, and a field is not just property. For a farming household, the field is the future. It is next year's food, next year's seed, next year's tax payment, next year's survival. When land becomes collateral, debt changes from a temporary problem into a structural one. A family that loses tools can still recover. A family that loses land loses the base of life. The creditor gains more than repayment. The creditor gains future power. This is why debt is not only about money. Debt can reorganize society. It can move land from many small farmers into the hands of a few creditors. It can turn free households into dependent households. It can make inequality permanent. Some ancient debtors did not simply lose things, they lost autonomy. In some traditions, a debtor or family member could enter the house of a creditor. That phrase sounds quiet, but it means a person's labor and freedom moved into another household. Debt could split families. One person might serve to repay the loan. Another might remain behind. A child, wife, or servant might be pledged. A body could become collateral. In early Rome, the Nexum contract made this frighteningly clear. A defaulting debtor could be bound to a creditor through a formal legal relationship. Debt was not only written on a tablet, it could be written onto the person. This is the darkest part of the debt system. A contract can look equal on paper. Two parties agree. One lends, one borrows. But if one person is desperate and the other is powerful, equality becomes an illusion. The law says agreement. The body feels command. When debt becomes too heavy, people do not always obey, they flee. Ancient sources describe indebted farmers abandoning fields, cities, and obligations. Some might become runaways. Some might join outsiders. Some might become a threat to the city itself. For rulers, this was a serious problem. A king needed farmers. Farmers produced grain. Grain fed cities. Farmers paid taxes. Farmers served in armies. If creditors swallowed the farmers, the king lost his base. No farmers, no taxes, no soldiers, no stability. This is why some ancient rulers cancelled debts, not only because they were kind, not only because they were utopian, but because the state could not survive if the creditor class captured the population. The clean slate was a reset. A ruler could break debt tablets, free debt servants, restore land, return people to households. Debt could grow into a crisis. So power sometimes cancelled debt to save society. Imagine a pile of clay tablets. Each tablet is a debt, a field, a person, a family, a future claim. Then imagine a ruler ordering the tablets broken. That is the clean slate. In Sumerian tradition, one word associated with freedom was amagi. It is often translated as a return to mother, a return home. That is a powerful idea. Freedom is not only escape, it is restoration. A debt servant returns to the household. A farmer returns to the field. A family returns to its own life. The king's role was not simply to protect creditors. The king also had to protect the social order from creditors. This is easy to misunderstand today. Debt cancellation sounds radical to modern ears, but in some ancient societies, it was part of how rulers maintained balance. If debts were never cancelled, creditors could become stronger than the palace. So the ruler intervened. The ledger was powerful, but the king could still break it. Hammurabi is famous for law, but debt relief was also part of ancient governance. Research on Mesopotamian history describes rulers issuing misharam decrees. These were acts of restoration. They could cancel certain personal debts, free debt servants, return people to their families, protect the king's tax and military base. Later, the idea of debt release appeared in biblical Jubilee traditions. There, debt forgiveness became more than royal policy. It became sacred time. A society was told to remember that land, labor, and life should not be trapped forever by debt. Even the Rosetta Stone, famous today because it helped decode Egyptian hieroglyphs, was also part of a decree that included debt and tax amnesty. That is a striking detail. A stone we remember as a language key was also a political debt document. Debt relief was not a marginal idea. It sat close to the center of ancient statecraft, because rulers knew something simple. If debt devours the people, the kingdom weakens. But not every society kept the clean slate. In parts of classical Greece and Rome, creditor power became harder to break. There was no Mesopotamian-style king regularly cancelling debts to restore balance. Aristocratic creditors gained ground. Debt markers appeared on land. Farmers lost freedom. In Athens, the crisis became severe. Solon's reforms in 594 BC, known as the Saisakthea, cancelled debts and banned debt slavery for Athenians. It was a desperate intervention to prevent social breakdown. Rome faced similar tensions. The Nexum contract allowed debt to reach the body of the debtor. Plebeians resisted creditor abuse. The conflict was not only economic, it was political. Who owned the citizen? The republic, the household, the creditor. When formal Nexum was eventually abolished, creditor power did not disappear. It shifted from the body to property, from chains to foreclosure, from direct bondage to structural dependence. Forgiveness weakened, the creditor class became more permanent. The creditor class changes society because it turns temporary need into lasting power. A loan taken during a bad season can become a claim over land. A missed payment can become a legal judgment. A private ledger can become a political force, but debt also shaped states in another way, through coins. One important theory argues that states did not spread coinage only to help friendly market exchange. They used coins to pay armies. A standing army creates a logistical problem. Soldiers need food, clothing, weapons, wages. Instead of directly feeding every soldier from palace stores, a state can pay soldiers in coins. Then it demands taxes from the population in the same coins. Now villagers need coins. Get coins, they sell goods. Food, cloth, labor. Suddenly a cash market grows around the army. This is the state credit view of money. It is debated, but it explains a powerful pattern. Taxes can create demand for money, and money can organize war. Alexander the Great's army required enormous quantities of silver. Some estimates suggest that his forces needed around half a ton of silver bullion per day for wages. That number is hard to forget. Half a ton, every day. An army is not just men and horses. It is a moving financial machine. Coins must be minted, bullion must be mined, paymasters must count, soldiers must be paid, markets must supply food, and mines must produce the metal. This creates a chain. Mines feed mints, mints feed armies, armies expand states, states demand taxes, taxes pull people into markets. The market can look free at the surface. People buy, people sell, coins move, but behind the coins may stand a tax collector, a soldier, a mine, a war. This does not mean every market is created by violence, but it shows that some cash economies expanded through state power. Money and war were often closer than we like to imagine. Debt is powerful because it does not remain only economic, it becomes moral. In some languages, the words for debt and guilt overlap. The German word Schuld can mean both debt and guilt. That is not just a linguistic curiosity. It reveals a deep association. To owe becomes to be at fault. To default becomes to fail morally. A debt may begin as a practical matter, a bad harvest, a medical need, a failed business, a war, but over time the debtor can be judged as irresponsible, weak, or sinful. This moral shift protects creditor power. If the debtor is guilty, the creditor looks righteous. If poverty is shame, collection feels like justice. This is how a financial relationship becomes a moral hierarchy. The debtor stands lower, the creditor stands higher. The contract seems neutral, but shame enters the room. Debt now controls not only property, it controls conscience. Debt prisons made the moral judgment physical. If you could not pay, you could be confined. That is a strange logic. A person in prison cannot easily work to repay a debt. But debt prisons were not only about efficiency, they were about punishment. They declared poverty to be a failure. They turned the debtor into a warning over centuries. Debt became an infinite obligation. Clay tablets, Roman contracts, medieval ledgers, prison records, modern loan forms. The objects change, the pattern remains. Someone's future income is claimed by someone else. Then in early modern Europe, debt scaled upward. It moved from households to states. Governments learned to borrow the future. A state could fight a war today and promise to pay later. It could turn future taxes into present power. This is one of the biggest transformations in debt history. Debt was no longer only a burden on the poor, it became a machine for state expansion. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded. It became part of a new relationship between the state and creditors. The British government could borrow more reliably. Creditors trusted that Parliament could raise taxes. Taxes made repayment believable. Repayment made lenders more willing to lend. This helped create what historians call the Fiscal-Military State, a state built to finance war, not only through immediate taxation, but through public debt. Think of it like this. A king with no credit can only fight with the money already in his chest. A state with credit can fight with money it has not yet collected. It borrows now. It taxes later. Public debt turns the future into a weapon. The bond certificate becomes a tool of war. The tax ledger becomes military infrastructure. The bank connects private wealth to public violence. This is not only financial history, it is empire history. War needed money, debt supplied time. Ships sailed on debt. A navy required timber, rope, iron, cannon, sailors, dockyards, and wages. All of that cost money before victory produced anything. Public borrowing helped bridge the gap, but war debt has a ratchet effect. War creates debt. Debt creates interest. Interest requires taxes. Those taxes often remain after the war ends. Then another war begins. More debt, more interest, more taxes. A ratchet moves one way. It tightens. This is how war can permanently expand the state. Perpetual bonds or consols made the pattern even clearer. The principal might not be repaid. The state simply paid interest indefinitely. For investors, the debt became income. For the state, the debt became a long-term obligation. For taxpayers, the war became a future burden. A battle may end in a year. Its interest can last for generations. Debt makes war longer than the war itself. Ships sailed on debt. A navy required timber, rope, iron, cannons, sailors, dockyards, and wages. All of that cost money before victory produced anything. Public borrowing helped bridge the gap, but war debt has a ratchet effect. War creates debt. Debt creates interest. Interest requires taxes. Those taxes often remain after the war ends. Then another war begins. More debt, more interest, more taxes. A ratchet moves one way. It tightens. This is how war can permanently expand the state. Perpetual bonds or consols made the pattern even clearer. The principal might not be repaid. The state simply paid interest indefinitely. For investors, the debt became income. For the state, the debt became a long-term obligation. For taxpayers, the war became a future burden. A battle may end in a year. Its interest can last for generations. Debt makes war longer than the war itself. In the 20th century, states brought debt into the household. War bonds turned citizens into lenders. A family could buy a bond at a post office, a bank, a factory booth, or through a public campaign. The message was simple: lend to the government, support the war, serve without fighting. This is patriotic debt. A household savings envelope becomes part of national finance. A child sees a poster. A worker buys a bond from wages. A family budget makes room for the state. During World War I, Liberty bonds helped finance the American war effort. The bond was more than a financial product. It was moral pressure. To buy was patriotic. To refuse could look selfish. This shows how debt and morality return again. The state borrows, the citizen lends. The obligation is wrapped in duty. Debt becomes not only a contract, it becomes belonging. During World War II, the United States used Series E bonds to mobilize household savings on a massive scale. Historical estimates put the campaign at about $185.7 billion raised from the public. That number shows the scale. Millions of small contributions became war finance. Factories produced weapons. Workers bought bonds. The state borrowed from its people. But bonds are not the only way wars are paid for. Inflation can also move the cost. Inflation is like an invisible tax. No one sends you a bill that says, war cost. Instead, prices rise. The money in your pocket buys less. Bread costs more. Fuel costs more. Savings lose weight. The state can shift purchasing power away from ordinary people without a visible tax vote. This does not mean all inflation has one cause, but in war finance, borrowing and money creation can push costs into prices. The public pays quietly, at the grocery store, at the market, in the value of savings. Weimar Germany is often remembered through images of hyperinflation, stacks of banknotes, prices changing rapidly, money losing meaning. The story is complicated, but one lesson is clear: financing war through debt and money creation can become dangerous when confidence collapses. Debt can move costs into the future. But the future eventually arrives. Children inherit tax systems, workers inherit inflation, citizens inherit public obligations created before they could vote. That is the power of sovereign debt. Nations can owe. A government can borrow from domestic citizens, foreign creditors, banks, bond markets, or international institutions. This can be useful. Debt can fund roads, schools, recovery, and crisis response. But it can also become leverage. When a country cannot repay, creditors gain influence. The question changes. Not only how much is owed, but who gets to decide the future budget, who gets paid first, and who must sacrifice. The 1980s debt crisis showed how international debt could reshape entire nations. Many countries borrowed heavily. Then interest rates rose, commodity prices shifted, currencies weakened, repayment became harder. Debtor nations had to negotiate with foreign banks, governments, and institutions. Loans came with conditions: cut spending, privatize, reduce subsidies, open markets, balance budgets. This is austerity. The word sounds technical, but it reaches daily life: a school budget, a hospital corridor, a public job, a fuel subsidy, a food price. When a country needs rescue money, sovereignty can shrink. The government still has a flag, a parliament, a president or prime minister, but the budget is now watched by creditors. The policy choices narrow. Debt does not need an army to control a state. Sometimes it needs a loan agreement, a deadline, a repayment schedule, and the fear of default. Zambia's recent debt restructuring shows a modern form of delay. After defaulting in 2020, Zambia faced years of negotiations under the G20 Common Framework. Different creditors had to agree. Talks dragged on, budgets waited, projects waited, people waited. A standstill can damage a country even before final terms are decided. This is not the same as ancient debt bondage. A modern nation is not a Roman nexum debtor. A household loan is not the same as being physically bound to a creditor. We must not flatten history. But the pattern echoes. Debt can narrow choices. Debt can transfer power. Debt can turn future labor, taxes, or income into someone else's claim. At the beginning of this story, debt was a memory, a favor, a promise. Then it became a tablet, a calculation, a field, a body, a coin, a bond, a bailout. The invisible pattern is this. Debt is not only about money owed, it is about who controls the future.